A fatal miscalculation. More than 6 months after the coronavirus first hit American shores, the US has failed spectacularly to contain the pandemic. Other countries that were once devastated by the virus, like Italy, France, Spain and Germany, have managed to bring infections and deaths to relatively low levels. But virus transmission has spiraled out of control in the United States, where nearly 4 million people have been infected. America keeps shattering its own daily infection records with around 60,000 people testing positive each day.
Compared to March and April, what are we seeing now in the ICU?
Oh, March was just a tip of the iceberg, and every day it's coming into more patients and they're very sick.
There's no indication that the Trump administration will do anything different to try to stop the spread of the virus.
In the process of developing a strategy that's going to be very, very powerful. We've developed them as we go along. Some areas of our country are doing very well, others are doing less well. It will probably, unfortunately, get worse before it gets better.
A secondary surge has come to the country. The crisis has exposed America's leadership failure, self-defeating political divide, and persistent economic and racial inequalities. The Trump administration's ineffective and chaotic response has shocked observers around the world. The federal government did not follow the expert advice, and now the American people are paying a heavy price for it with their lives and livelihoods.
All of the answers are there. The scientists have the answers. We know that testing, tracing, treating, distancing, masking, sanitation can stop the spread of this virus. And yet the president continues to go down the wrong path and refuses to ask for directions.
The federal response has been defined by dysfunctional policies, a disinformation campaign, lack of funding for public health, and a rush to reopen the economy.
So the coronavirus has exposed the United States government for what it is. It's really an oligarchy that is dedicated to the continuous enrichment of the wealthy and not the needs of the people. The country's leadership has been a complete failure in the face of this crisis, which has made things worse because the people are not receiving the care and the response to a pandemic that we should normally see from a government, particularly a government that claims to be, a power among the world.
The Trump administration shifted responsibility for responding to the pandemic from the federal government to the states with disastrous results. Testing shortcomings that crippled the national response in March have become more acute, with people in coronavirus hot zones having to wait for a week or more for test results. President Trump's belief that the cure cannot be worse than the disease has made matters even worse.
There's this continuing fallacy that I find among the leadership in many states across America, and certainly in Arizona, and that people think that you can somehow bluff this virus. This virus doesn't care about your feelings. This virus doesn't care about your business. We're going to lose if we continue to try to fix the economic crisis without first fixing the public health crisis.
President Trump has said the coronavirus would disappear, fade away, or go away more than a dozen times since the outbreak started in the United States. Despite a frightening spike in new cases, he's sticking to his early predictions on COVID-19.
Coronavirus, I think that at some point that's going to sort of just disappear, I hope. I'll be right eventually. Say this, schools have to open, young people have to go to school.
With the country reeling from the pandemic, the Trump administration is pushing to reopen schools as the CDC warns that the number of infections is probably 10 times higher than reported. Teachers and parents are worried.
As Rachel said, it's just not safe, and I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is we're scared. You know, we're scared. We don't want to bury a student. We don't want to bury a colleague. And most importantly, we really don't want, you know, us or our students to be bringing this stuff home and spreading it throughout the community. I mean, things will balloon.
Has the federal response made the pandemic worse in the United States?
Definitely. The worst part of this crisis has been the federal response. The federal response has been a complete disaster. The government has failed to do just about anything right, and that is not an exaggeration. The government has failed to make testing widely available. Even right now, there are still not enough testing sites. We know that test results do take a long time. The federal government has basically given up on trying to do any contact tracing. In addition to that, we need to remember that the United States does not have universal health care. There were already over 25 million people without health insurance, and an additional about 27 million are scheduled to lose their health insurance because their health insurance was tied to their employment. And given that millions have been laid off, that also means that not only did they lose their income, but they also lost their medical insurance.
People of a country usually come together in times of crisis. But this hasn't been the case in America. The coronavirus crisis has been sucked into the vortex of the country's political divide. Early in the outbreak, President Trump dismissed the virus as a hoax engineered by his political opponents to hurt his re-election. He's cheered his supporters to protest shutdowns imposed by Democratic governors.
You've seen deaths up in New York, deaths up in Chicago, shootings. How do you explain it, and what are you going to do about it?
I explain it very simply by saying they're Democrat-run cities, they're liberally run, they're stupidly run.
Liberal Democrats have been running cities in this country for decades.
Trump refused to wear a mask in public until July 11th. Following the president's lead, many of Trump's supporters have also refused to wear masks or observe social distancing.
Are you going to allow the government to tell you you have to wear a mask?
Wearing a mask can actually cause you to get sick. So
wearing a mask can actually cause you to get sick.
Yes, absolutely.
Millions of Americans have been led to believe that the pandemic has been exaggerated or even fabricated by scientists and what Trump calls the fake news media. The daughter of an Arizona man who lost his life to COVID-19 this month made headlines after she blamed politicians for her father's death.
My dad was a supporter of the governor as well as the president and was following their advice. So whenever, I would call him and say, Dad, this is still a crisis. It's not safe to be out there. His response was, well, Kristen, why would the governor say it was safe if it wasn't safe?
But the Trump administration's campaign of misinformation is not all that has aggravated the crisis. The White House is reportedly seeking to block billions of dollars in funding for coronavirus testing and tracing, efforts that scientists say are critical to slowing the spread of the virus. Trump has called coronavirus testing a double-edged sword and has called on officials to slow down testing.
By having more tests, we find more cases. Therefore, we test, we're going to have more cases. By having more cases, it sounds bad.
Observers say the president is worried about how a spike in cases might reflect on his poll numbers.
The Trump administration is more focused into winning the next election, that they are willing to sacrifice the American public. They do not care how many people die as a result of that. Donald Trump continues to hold rallies, bringing together thousands of people, even though he knows that that's an opportunity for the virus to continue to spread.
Trump and his loyalists have also engaged in a smear campaign against Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert. For Trump, Dr. Fauci has been an annoying voice, challenging his campaign of falsehoods and blame shifting.
People have their opinion about my reaction to things. I consider myself more a realist than an alarmist, but people do have their opinions other than that. I've always thought of myself as a realist.
Dr. Fauci, who's been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for 36 years, said White House efforts to discredit him will ultimately harm President Trump. Why has the coronavirus crisis become so politicized in America?
The coronavirus has become a political issue in the United States, mainly as a distraction to the lack of leadership and preparedness for this crisis. Donald Trump has used this campaign as an opportunity to do what's best for states that support him and governors that support him, and basically disregard other states and people that do not support him. So we have really become the laughing stock of the world. But this is just a great example of what happens when you have rich and wealthy people in power who do not care more about their next election and their own benefit than they care about saving people that can be saved during this crisis.
With COVID-19 cases and deaths rising, the pandemic's devastating cycle is repeating itself all over again. Businesses are shutting down and jobs are fast disappearing.
Today, we are announcing additional statewide actions as it relates to our stay-at-home order here in the state of California. We are now effective today, requiring all counties to close their indoor activities, their indoor operations.
All this comes as the first round of federal aid, a $2.2 trillion relief package that Congress passed in spring, is running out. The package included $600 weekly unemployment benefits for roughly 30 million unemployed Americans. The aid expires at the end of this month, leaving a deeply partisan Congress with the task of drafting another costly rescue. Since the pandemic emerged in the United States, President Trump has prioritized the economy over public health. A resurgence of the virus is now threatening the fragile economic recovery. Has Trump's response been a miscalculation?
The pandemic has devastated so many workers and their families, and it will continue to get worse. Our economy will collapse pretty soon, and I believe that it will only get worse. The impact will leave working families and poor workers more vulnerable than ever. Jobs have been lost. People have lost their health insurance. Many people have already run out of food and are having trouble feeding their families. As we have seen, there are many bank foods and people who are donating food in order to feed those that are already out of food. And it's just been a complete devastation to so many working families, to millions of people that still don't know, that are facing evictions from their homes, that do not have health care if they actually get sick, so many that have lost their jobs. It has just been economically devastating to so many workers.
Before the virus, President Trump's pitch to the American voters was a strong economy. The unemployment rate stood at a half-century low, and stock markets were doing very well.
The markets have gone through the roof since November 9th. That's the day after I won the election. Whether you love me or hate me, you gotta vote for me.
Then the pandemic hit, and everything changed. With tens of millions of Americans now out of a job and the COVID-19 on the minds of voters, support for the Republican president is waning fast. Trump had to replace his campaign manager less than 4 months before the election. Former Vice President Joe Biden is now leading Trump by a national average of about 10 percentage points.
Hospitalizations and deaths, two of the most concerning indicators of Trump's failed response, are already unacceptably high, and they are rising. It's gotten bad enough that even Donald Trump finally decided to wear a mask in public. I'm glad he made the shift, but Mr. President, it's not enough. We won't be able to turn the corner and get American people back to work safely without presidential leadership.
A new ABC News Washington Post poll finds that Biden is ahead of Trump 55% to 40% among registered voters, a commanding lead of 15 points. Trump's handling of the virus has been a major factor. 60% of voters disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic, as opposed to 38% who approve. The public is also at odds with the president on coronavirus testing and the need to wear masks. Is Trump's re-election campaign on life support?
Trump's election is definitely on life support. Due to his management of this crisis, he has lost a lot of supporters, even within their own party. But he has repeatedly shown that he's more concerned with the poll numbers than he is with people. I believe that the survival of so many people in America depends on Trump not being reelected. So I'm hoping that this November, the American public can remember how devastating the management of this crisis has been at the hands of Donald Trump.
Cracks widen in transatlantic alliance. Europe's top court in Luxembourg has struck down a major agreement governing the transfer of EU citizens' data to the United States. The European Court of Justice ruled this month that EU regulators must block tech companies from transferring data outside the bloc, where privacy rules are violated. A privacy advocate had challenged the US-EU data sharing agreement, known as the Privacy Shield, arguing that US national security laws did not protect EU citizens from US government snooping. Max Schrems, the Austrian behind the case, called the EU court's decision a win for privacy.
For many of these US companies in the long term, it's going to be a huge issue that they fall under these surveillance laws when they're headquartered in the US. And a lot of international customers are simply not going to trust that anymore. And I think that is something that this judgment cannot solve, but that is a huge issue that we have to talk in general about. Because if the Silicon Valley wants to have the data of the whole world, which it does, then it cannot at the same time be subject to surveillance laws that basically don't have any rights for foreigners.
This is a bold move by Europe. Is Europe sending a signal to the United States?
This is a very clear signal from Europe to America because of the interference that's been seen in a lot of European information in terms of actually making sure that European data, and more to the point, individual information on people is kept secure. There's always been a mismatch between the ability of Europe to see American information on people and the Americans' view that they should be able to see European information on people.
Ever since Edward Snowden, the contractor who worked for the US National Security Agency, blew the whistle on the scale of US surveillance, Europeans have been complaining that their data is not safe from American snooping.
And Germany is expressing concern over the ability of the NSA to spy on EU citizens. Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, wants an overhaul of EU privacy laws that can protect European citizens from alleged American snooping.
Now, a blow against the Privacy Shield will definitely increase tensions between Brussels and Washington, at a time when the US is threatening to hit EU countries with billions of dollars in tariffs over digital taxes. Experts warn that a protracted legal dispute between the US and the EU could trigger a geopolitical crisis.
And unfortunately, what we're dealing with at the moment is an extremely unreliable administration in America. The Trump administration has been very inconsistent in its leadership over many things, as it seems to vary according to what the last idea was in his head. But certainly Europe has been very annoyed at the fact that data might be open for further examination by America, and this hasn't been properly reciprocated.
Tensions are also mounting over US threats to impose sanctions against European companies working on Russian oil pipeline projects. The US House of Representatives has passed a measure to sanction European companies helping Russia complete a natural gas pipeline to Germany. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline would transport gas to Europe under the Baltic Sea. Another Russian project that has Washington worried is the Turk Stream 2, running an oil pipeline through Europe to Turkey.
Today, the Department of State is updating the public guidance for CATSA authorities to include Nord Stream 2 and the second line of Turk Stream 2. This action puts investments or other activities that are related to these Russian energy export pipelines at risk of U.S. sanctions. It's a clear warning to companies aiding and abetting Russia's malign influence projects will not be tolerated. Get out now or risk the consequences.
The Trump administration believes the projects will boost Moscow's economic and political influence in Europe.
They are Kremlin's key tools to exploit and expand European dependence on Russian energy supplies. Tools that undermine Ukraine by cutting off gas transiting that critical democracy, a tool that ultimately undermines transatlantic security.
The EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, blasted the US for targeting European companies for carrying out legitimate and lawful activities under European law. Why is the US taking such a measure? What are the long-term implications of it?
The Trump policy reacting against Russia and being able to effectively pass the responsibility onto Europe in a way which is, again, really rather unfair and doesn't really appreciate Europe's position and agreement with regard to Russia. EU will not take kindly to sanctions against them for this, for which is a perfectly legitimate agreement. The ability, therefore, or the threat, therefore, of America to try and take out sanctions against Europe would be very counterproductive indeed.
Experts say it wouldn't be a stretch to look at these recent incidents as evidence of an emerging rupture in transatlantic relations. The rift has been growing ever since Donald Trump became president in the United States and began tearing up a host of agreements.
To be honest with you, Europe has been very, very tough to deal with. They've taken advantage of our country, the European Union, for many, many years.
Now, Europeans actively seek greater diplomatic and security autonomy from America. Trump is trying to undermine such efforts through economic and trade measures.
It is very strange that this Trump administration has been so aggressive towards its primary ally, the European Union. When you think about it, actually, it seems wholly illogical. The Trump administration has been firing undiplomatic arguments against China with regard to the differences in trade. In fact, of course, America has benefited from trade with China with low-cost manufacturing, benefiting the economy. But Trump merely shows his level of ignorance and lack of understanding of how global trade works.
As the US has engaged in a bitter trade war with China, Europe has increasingly been embracing China as a strategic and economic partner. On big international affairs like the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Accord, the EU could be seen to have sided with China over its oldest ally. Washington has sharply escalated its reprisals against Beijing, leading to fears of a new Cold War. Further souring the ties, Trump has ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston, allegedly to protect American intellectual property and private information.
We are setting out clear expectations for how the Chinese Communist Party is going to behave. And when they don't, we're going to take actions that protect the American people.
China has strongly condemned the outrageous and unjustified move and promised to take countermeasures. Trump, however, has threatened to close down more Chinese consulates in America. As the Trump administration ratchets up tensions with China, Europe is caught up in the middle. Where is the transatlantic alliance headed?
The EU, I suspect its leaders, will be hoping for a change of administration in the autumn to then have a new leadership who will take possibly a more constructive and creative, and if I may be so rude, intelligent view as to how this can be progressed overall.